breaking news on ABC 17 News on KMIZ.
Breaking news. Within the last few minutes, we have learned that convicted killer Brian Dorsey has been executed. Let's take a listen at the live press conference there tonight.
April 9, 2024, 6:11 p.m. Bonne Terre Prison, Missouri. A man takes his final breath, and with it, one of the most controversial executions in recent American history comes to an end. But here's what makes this story absolutely mind-blowing. Just 7 hours earlier, that same man was sitting in a cell, devouring 2 double cheeseburgers, chicken strips with extra sauce, a mountain of fries, an entire pizza loaded with sausage, pepperoni, onions, mushrooms, and extra cheese. His last meal, his final earthly pleasure before facing the ultimate punishment. Yet here's the part that will shock you. 72 prison guards, the very people who watched over him for nearly 2 decades, were desperately fighting to save his life. Corrections officers don't typically become advocates for death row inmates. So what made Brian Dorsey so different? This isn't your typical death row story. This is a case of a man who committed an unthinkable double murder on Christmas Eve 2006, yet somehow managed to transform himself so completely that an unprecedented coalition formed to save his life. We're talking about current and former corrections officers, a retired Missouri Supreme Court judge, legislators from both political parties, faith leaders, mental health experts, and even some members of the victims' own families, all united in one desperate plea to Governor Mike Parson. They weren't asking for Brian Dorsey to walk free. They were begging for his death sentence to be commuted to life without parole. The question that haunted everyone involved was simple yet profound. Can a person truly change? And if they can, does that change matter when weighed against the gravity of their crimes? Before we dive into this incredible story, hit that subscribe button, because cases like Brian Dorsey's will make you question everything you think you know about justice, redemption, and whether the death penalty serves its intended purpose. And drop a comment below letting me know where you're watching from. I love connecting with viewers from around the world. Over the next hour, we're going to unpack one of the most complex true crime cases in recent memory. We'll start with the horrific Christmas Eve murders in 2006 that left 2 young parents dead and their 4-year-old daughter traumatized. Sarah and Benjamin Bonney were shot with their own shotgun by someone they trusted, Brian Dorsey, Sarah's own cousin. But then we'll explore something remarkable, 18 years of genuine transformation behind bars. We'll hear from the corrections officers who watched Dorsey evolve from a violent, drug-addled killer into someone they trusted with their lives daily as their prison barber. We'll examine the last meal that captured national attention and made headlines across the country. And we'll read his final words, a statement so profound and remorseful that it left even his harshest critics questioning their stance. This is the story of Brian Dorsey, a tale of unspeakable violence, unexpected redemption, and the ultimate question of whether some crimes are simply unforgivable. December 23rd, 2006, New Bloomfield, Missouri. Christmas Eve was just hours away, and most families were settling in for a cozy evening of last-minute gift wrapping and holiday preparations. But for Brian Joseph Dorsey, this night will become the defining moment that destroyed multiple lives forever. At 34 years old, Dorsey was drowning. Drug addiction had consumed his life, and the debts were piling up fast. We're not talking about owing money to a bank or credit card company. Brian owed money to drug dealers, the kind of people who don't send polite reminder notices or negotiate payment plans. They make threats. They follow through on those threats. And Brian knew his time was running out. Desperate and running out of options, he did what many of us might do in a crisis. He reached out to family. That evening, Brian made a phone call that would haunt everyone involved forever. He called his cousin, Sarah Bonney. Sarah, just 25 years old, had always been the type of person who would help family in need. She was kind, caring, and unfortunately for her, she said yes when Brian asked if he could come over. Sarah in Bonnie was everything you'd want in a family member. At 25, she had her whole life ahead of her, a loving marriage, a beautiful daughter, and a kind of heart that made her the person everyone turned to when they needed help. She worked hard, loved deeply, and had that rare quality of putting others before herself. When Brian called that night, desperate and scared, Sarah didn't hesitate. Family was family, and family helped each other out. Her husband, Benjamin Wade Bonnie, was 28 and completely devoted to his wife and child. Ben was a steady, reliable type, a man who worked hard to provide for his family and who had welcomed Sarah's extended family, including Brian, into their home on previous occasions. He was protective but not suspicious, trusting but not naive. When Sarah told him Brian needed help, Ben didn't object. They had helped Brian before, and they would help him again. But there was someone else in the house that night, their 4-year-old daughter. A little girl who should have been dreaming about Santa Claus and Christmas morning, completely unaware that her world was about to be shattered forever. What happened next in that new Bloomfield home defies comprehension. Brian Dorsey didn't just ask for money. He turned on the very people who had opened their door to help him. Using Sarah and Ben's own shotgun, a weapon they kept in their home for protection, Brian shot both of them dead. But the violence didn't end there. In a horrific escalation that revealed the depths of his depravity, Brian sexually assaulted Sarah's lifeless body. Then, in a desperate attempt to destroy evidence, he poured bleach over her, trying to eliminate any DNA traces that might connect him to the crime. The chemical smell would later help investigators piece together what had happened in those final, terrifying moments. While Brian was committing these unspeakable acts, that 4-year-old little girl was somewhere in the house. Imagine the horror. A child who should have been safely tucked in bed, excited about Christmas morning, instead trapped in a house with her parents' killer. By some miracle, Brian left her physically unharmed, but the psychological damage would last a lifetime. Before leaving, Brian stole personal items from the home, adding theft to his list of crimes. Then he simply walked away, leaving behind a scene of devastation that would haunt investigators, family members, and an entire community for years to come. For 3 agonizing days, Brian Dorsey was a fugitive. While families across Missouri were celebrating Christmas, opening presents, and sharing meals together, Sarah and Ben's bodies lay undiscovered. Their 4-year-old daughter, traumatized beyond imagination, was found and taken to safety, but the damage was already done. Christmas would never be the same for this family. Meanwhile, Brian was on a run, knowing that every knock on the door, every police siren, every phone call could be the end. But perhaps the weight of what he had done became too much to bear, or maybe he realized there was nowhere left to hide. On December 26th, 3 days after the murders, Brian Dorsey made a decision that would seal his fate. He surrendered to police. And then he did something that surprised everyone. He confessed, not just to being there, not just to the shooting, but to everything. He laid out the entire horrific sequence of events, holding nothing back. His full confession would become the cornerstone of the prosecution's case against him. The small community of New Bloomfield was in shock. How could a family member, someone who had been welcomed into their home, commit such unspeakable acts of violence and betrayal? Two years after that horrific Christmas Eve, Brian Dorsey found himself facing the full weight of Missouri's justice system. In 2008, he stood trial for the first-degree murders of Sarah and Benjamin Bonnie, with his own detailed confession as the prosecution's star evidence. The question wasn't whether he was guilty. It was whether he would live or die for his crimes. The trial moved swiftly. Dorsey was convicted on both counts of first-degree murder, and the jury didn't hesitate in their sentencing recommendation. They handed down 2 death sentences, one for each life he had taken. In Missouri, that meant Brian Dorsey would be executed by lethal injection unless something extraordinary happened to change his fate. But even as the gavel fell and Dorsey was led away to death row, serious questions were already emerging about the quality of his legal defense. His attorneys would later argue that they had been operating under a flat fee arrangement with the court, essentially a fixed payment regardless of how much time and effort they put into the case. This type of arrangement, critics argue, creates a perverse incentive where lawyers are financially motivated to do the bare minimum rather than mount the most thorough defense possible. Think about that for a moment. In a case where someone's life literally hangs in the balance, where the difference between life and death might come down to a single piece of evidence or one persuasive argument, Dorsey's lawyers had a financial incentive to wrap things up quickly and move on to the next case. This case raises serious questions about our justice system. Drop a comment below. Do you think the quality of legal defense should depend on money? Should someone's life or death sentence hinge on whether they can afford the best lawyers, or whether their court-appointed attorneys are properly incentivized to fight for them? As the appeals process began, Dorsey's new legal team started uncovering disturbing details about his mental state on the night of the murders. They argued that Brian had been in the grip of severe drug-induced psychosis when he committed these horrific acts. According to their research, he had been using methamphetamines heavily in the days leading up to the crime, and a combination of drug withdrawal, desperation, and chemical imbalance had created a perfect storm of mental instability. This was an attempt to excuse what he'd done. The murders of Sarah and Ben were inexcusable regardless of Brian's mental state. But in death penalty cases, mental health can be the difference between execution and life in prison. The legal system recognizes that someone who commits murder while in the grip of severe mental illness or drug-induced psychosis may be less culpable than someone who coldly plans and executes the same crime. The question became, had Brian's original defense team adequately investigated and presented these mental health issues? Had they brought in the right experts, conducted the necessary psychological evaluations, and painted a complete picture of Brian's mental state for the jury to consider? The appeals process in death penalty cases is deliberately long and thorough. It has to be. When the state is preparing to take someone's life, every legal avenue must be exhausted, every constitutional question must be addressed, and every potential error must be examined under a microscope. For Brian Dorsey, this meant nearly 16 years of legal battles ahead. His appeals would wind through state courts, federal courts, and eventually all the way to the United States Supreme Court. Each appeal would raise the same fundamental questions. Had he received adequate legal representation? Was his mental state properly considered? Had the original trial been fair? What happened to Brian Dorsey over the next 18 years on Missouri's death row was nothing short of extraordinary. The violent, drug-addled man who had committed those horrific murders on Christmas Eve 2006 began a transformation that would shock everyone who witnessed it. From the moment he arrived at Potosi Correctional Center and later Bonne Terre prison, Brian made a choice. He could spend his remaining years angry, violent, and consumed by the same rage and addiction that had led to his crimes. Or he could try to become something different. He chose transformation. His disciplinary record tells the story better than any words could. 18 years, 0 infractions, 0 fights, 0 incidents. In a prison environment where violence is common and tensions run high, Brian Dorsey became known as the inmate who never caused trouble. But it went far beyond just staying out of trouble. He actively worked to make the prison a better, safer place for everyone. The most remarkable testament to his transformation was his job assignment: prison barber. Think about that for a moment. The prison administration trusted a man convicted of violent murder with sharp instruments every single day. Razors, scissors, clippers, tools that could easily become weapons in the wrong hands. Yet Brian handled these instruments with the care and responsibility of a professional, cutting hair for both inmates and staff members who came to trust him completely. As Brian's execution date approached in 2024, something unprecedented began to happen. A coalition of supporters started forming that defense attorneys had never seen before in a death penalty case. We're not talking about the usual suspects, family members, anti-death penalty activists, or religious groups who routinely oppose executions. This was different. 72 current and former corrections officers, the very people who had worked alongside Brian for nearly 2 decades, signed a clemency petition asking Governor Mike Parson to spare his life. These are tough, experienced professionals who have seen every type of criminal imaginable. They don't get sentimental about inmates, and they certainly don't risk their professional reputations lightly. Yet they were willing to put their names on the line for Brian Dorsey. The coalition grew beyond the prison walls. A former Missouri Supreme Court judge, someone who had spent their entire career weighing questions of justice and punishment, joined the cause. Faith leaders from multiple denominations added their voices, arguing that Brian's transformation represented the very redemption their religions preached about. Perhaps most remarkably, legislators from both political parties, Democrats and Republicans who agreed on almost nothing else, found common ground in supporting clemency for Brian Dorsey. Mental health experts who had evaluated him testified to the genuineness of his transformation and remorse. But the most powerful voices of all came from an unexpected source. Some members of the victims' own families. People who had every right to demand Brian's execution instead chose to support commuting his sentence to life without parole. So what exactly made Brian Dorsey so different from other death row inmates? The corrections officers who worked with him daily had countless stories. They described a man who genuinely cared about others, who went out his way to help both staff and fellow inmates. When new corrections officers started their jobs, often nervous and uncertain in the dangerous prison environment, Brian would quietly reassure them, help them understand the routines, and make their transition easier. His work as a barber became legendary within the prison system. Inmates would specifically request Brian to cut their hair, not just because he was skilled with the clippers, but because he treated everyone with dignity and respect. He listened to their problems, offered advice when asked, and became an unofficial counselor for men struggling with their own demons. Some inmates credited Brian with helping them turn their own lives around. But perhaps most importantly, Brian never tried to minimize or excuse what he had done. In a prison system full of inmates who maintain their innocence or blame others for their crimes, Brian stood out because of his complete acceptance of responsibility. He expressed genuine remorse not just in words, but in actions. Every day of his incarceration was spent trying to atone for the unforgivable acts he had committed. The support Brian received was absolutely unprecedented. Have you ever seen a case where this many people fought for someone on death row? Let me know in the comments what you think about redemption and second chances. Can someone who had committed the worst possible crime still find a path to genuine transformation? The corrections officers who signed that clemency petition weren't naive bleeding hearts. They were hard-nosed professionals who had seen the worst of humanity every day for decades. They knew the difference between inmates who were gaming the system and someone who had genuinely changed. In their professional opinion, Brian Dorsey had become a different person than the man who had committed those murders 18 years earlier. This raised a profound question that would haunt everyone involved in his case. If a person can truly change, if they can transform from a violent criminal into someone who makes the world around them better, does that transformation matter? Does it change what justice looks like? And perhaps most difficult of all, can some crimes be so heinous that redemption, no matter how genuine, simply isn't enough? As Brian Dorsey's execution date approached, his legal team raised a disturbing new argument that would add another layer of complexity to an already extraordinary case. Brian's physical condition presented serious medical concerns that could turn his execution into something resembling torture. Over 18 years in prison, Brian had become severely obese. Combined with his diabetes and his history of intravenous drug use from his addiction days, finding a suitable vein for lethal injection would be extremely difficult, if not impossible. His lawyers argued that the execution team would likely need to perform what's called a cut-down procedure, essentially surgical incisions to locate and access a vein deep beneath the skin and tissue. Here's where it gets truly disturbing. This cut-down procedure will be performed without anesthetic. Brian would be conscious and fully aware as medical personnel made surgical incisions in his arms, legs, or potentially his neck, searching for a vein suitable for the lethal injection. The process could take hours, with Brian experiencing excruciating pain throughout. His attorneys argued this violated the Eighth Amendment's prohibition against cruel and unusual punishment. The irony was stark. The state was so committed to executing Brian humanely that they were prepared to torture him first. How could a procedure that would be considered medical malpractice in any other context suddenly become acceptable because it was part of an execution? All eyes turned to Missouri Governor Mike Parson as a clemency petition landed on his desk. This wasn't just any clemency request. It was backed by the most diverse and powerful coalition anyone had ever seen in a death penalty case. 72 corrections officers, a former state Supreme Court judge, legislators from both parties, faith leaders, and even some victims' family members. The pressure was immense. Governor Parson faced an impossible political calculation. On one hand, he had law enforcement professionals, people his political base typically supported, arguing passionately that Brian deserved to live. On the other hand, commuting the sentence of someone who had committed such brutal murders would inevitably draw criticism from victims' rights advocates and tough-on-crime voters. For weeks, speculation swirled about which way the governor would lean. Legal experts pointed out that if any case deserved clemency based on transformation and rehabilitation, this was it. The evidence of Brian's change was overwhelming and came from the most credible sources possible. Then came the announcement that crushed the hopes of Brian's supporters. On April 8th, just one day before the scheduled execution, Governor Parson denied the clemency petition. Despite the unprecedented support, despite the medical concerns, despite 18 years of exemplary behavior, the execution would proceed as planned. With clemency denied, Brian's attorneys launched into their final, desperate legal maneuvers. They filed 2 emergency appeals with the United States Supreme Court, raising the same constitutional questions that had defined his case for years. Had he received adequate legal representation at his original trial? Did his transformation over 18 years matter in the eyes of justice? And most urgently, would forcing him to endure a painful cut-down procedure constitute cruel and unusual punishment? The clock was ticking mercilessly. Every hour that passed brought Brian closer to 6 p.m. on April 9th, his scheduled execution time. His legal team worked frantically, knowing that the Supreme Court was their last hope. If the highest court in the land declined to intervene, there would be nowhere left to turn. The Supreme Court's response was swift and devastating. They declined to hear both appeals, effectively sealing Brian Dorsey's fate. No stays would be granted. No further delays would be considered. After 18 years on death row, 6 years longer than he had lived as a free man after committing his crimes, Brian's time had run out. The final chapter of this extraordinary case was about to be written in the execution chamber at Bonne Terre prison. April 9th, 2024 began like any other day at Bonne Terre prison, but everyone knew this would be Brian Dorsey's last sunrise. The execution protocols that had been refined over decades swung into motion with clinical precision. Brian was moved to a holding cell closer to the execution chamber, where he would spend his final hours under constant supervision. Throughout the morning, a steady stream of visitors made their way through the prison's security checkpoints. Family members who had watched Brian transform over 18 years came to say their final goodbyes. Spiritual advisors, who had worked with him throughout his incarceration, offered comfort and prayers. These weren't the quick, impersonal visits typical of prison life. These were sacred moments, heavy with the weight of finality. Outside the prison walls, The media circus was in full swing. News vans lined the streets. Reporters delivered live updates, and protesters on both sides of the death penalty debate held vigil. Some carried signs demanding justice for Sarah and Ben Bonnie. Others held candles and called for mercy, carrying photos of the transformed man Brian had become. The contrast was stark. Inside, a man prepared to meet his fate with dignity. Outside, a society grappled with questions of justice, redemption, and revenge. At 11 a.m. sharp, prison staff delivered what will become one of the most talked about last meals in recent memory. Brian had requested what could only be described as a fast food feast. 2 double cheeseburgers, 2 orders of chicken strips, 2 large servings of French fries, and a pizza loaded with sausage, pepperoni, onions, mushrooms, and extra cheese. The psychology behind last meal requests has fascinated criminologists for decades. Some condemned prisoners choose elaborate, expensive dishes they never had a chance to try. Others select comfort foods from their childhood, seeking solace in familiar flavors during their final hours. Still others, in a final act of defiance or depression, refuse to eat at all. Brian's choice seemed to reflect something different. A man making peace with simple pleasures. There was no pretension in his selection, no attempt to make a statement. Just a kind of hearty, satisfying food that might represent the basic human comforts he was about to leave behind forever. The public's fascination with last meals speaks to something deeper in our collective psyche. Perhaps we're trying to understand how someone faces their final moments, or maybe we're searching for some glimpse of humanity in people who have committed inhuman acts. As the afternoon wore on, Brian prepared his final statement, words that would be his last communication to the world. What he wrote was a testament to the transformation that had taken place over 18 years, a message that would resonate far beyond the walls of Bonne Terre prison. To all the family and loved ones I share with Sarah and to all the surviving family and loved ones of Ben, I am truly, deeply, overwhelmingly sorry. Words cannot hold the just weight of my guilt and shame. I still love you. I never wanted to hurt anyone. I am sorry I hurt them and you. These weren't the hollow words of someone trying to escape responsibility or garner sympathy. This was complete accountability, raw and unfiltered. Brian didn't try to explain away his actions or blame his addiction. He owned what he had done completely, but his message didn't end with apology. He continued, "To my family, friends, and all of those that tried to prevent this, I love you. I am grateful for you. I have peace in my heart, in large part because of you, and I thank you. To all those on all sides of the sentence, I carry no ill will or anger, only acceptance and understanding." At 6 p.m., Brian Dorsey was escorted to the execution chamber. Despite all the medical concerns his lawyers had raised about finding suitable veins, the procedure proceeded without the feared complications. The execution team was able to establish IV access without resorting to the painful cut-down procedure that had haunted his final appeals. The witnesses, a mix of victims' family members, Brian's supporters, prison officials, and media representatives, watched in silence as a single dose of pentobarbital began flowing through the IV line. Brian's final moments were peaceful, a stark contrast to the violent way he had ended the lives of Sarah and Ben Bonnie 18 years earlier. At 6:11 p.m., Brian Joseph Dorsey was pronounced dead. The man who had walked into prison as a drug-addicted killer had died as someone the corrections officers who knew him best considered friend. An 18-year journey of transformation had come to its end, leaving everyone who witnessed it to grapple with profound questions about justice, redemption, and what it truly means to pay for one's crimes. The execution of Brian Dorsey forces us to confront some of the most difficult questions our justice system faces. What does justice actually look like in a case like this? Is it the swift punishment of a killer, ensuring he pays the ultimate price for taking 2 innocent lives? Or is it recognizing that a human being can fundamentally change and choosing mercy over vengeance? These questions become even more complex when we consider the voices of those who knew Brian best during his final years. 72 corrections officers, people who work in one of the most dangerous, cynical environments imaginable, believe so strongly in his transformation that they risk their professional reputations to save his life. These aren't people who get fooled easily or who have romantic notions about rehabilitation. They see the worst of humanity every single day, and they were convinced that Brian Dorsey had become something different. The purpose of the death penalty itself comes into question. Is it about deterrence, revenge, closure for victims' families? Or is it simply about removing dangerous people from society permanently? Brian's case challenges every one of these justifications. Brian Dorsey's case has already begun influencing death penalty discussions across Missouri and beyond. Legal scholars point to it as a prime example of why clemency processes exist, to account for circumstances that rigid sentencing guidelines can't anticipate. The unprecedented coalition that formed around his case has forced politicians, judges, and citizens to reconsider what rehabilitation actually means and whether it should matter in capital cases. The corrections officers who fought for Brian's life didn't simply return to their jobs and forget. Many have spoken publicly about the experience, describing how working with Brian changed their own perspectives on crime, punishment, and human nature. Their willingness to advocate for him has sparked conversations in law enforcement circles about the difference between justice and vengeance. Perhaps most significantly, the case highlighted the varied responses within victims' families. While some demanded Brian's execution, others supported clemency, showing that even those most directly harmed by crime don't always speak with one voice about punishment. This case challenges everything we think we know about justice, redemption, and the death penalty. What's your take? Are you for or against capital punishment after hearing Brian's story? Subscribe for more complex true crime cases that will make you think, and hit that notification bell so you never miss an upload. The story of Brian Dorsey reminds us that true crime isn't always black and white. Real cases involve real people with complex histories, genuine transformations, and impossible moral dilemmas. Behind every headline about murder and execution are human stories that defy easy categorization. The tension between justice for victims and the possibility of redemption will never be fully resolved. Sarah and Ben Bonnie deserve to live, to watch their daughter grow up, to celebrate many more Christmases together. Nothing, not Brian's transformation, not his remorse, not the support of 72 corrections officers, can bring them back or undo the trauma inflicted on their child. But Brian's story also proves that people can change, even in the darkest circumstances. Whether that change matters enough to spare a life remains one of the most profound questions our society faces. Thank you for watching Not True Crimes Untangled.